I'm Avinash Luthria, and this is a guest video on freefincal. The topic for this video is retirement planning is the hardest problem in finance. So some context about myself would be useful. I'm an hourly free financial planner and a SEBI registered investment advisor. Prior to this, I used to be a private equity investor for 12 years, and I have an MBA, a 2-year full-time MBA in finance from IIM Bangalore. So, a common claim that I've come across in various forms is that financial planning is just common sense. And there are very many variants of this, that financial planning is simple, there are no correct or wrong answers. There are just so many variants of this. You can read any book on financial planning and learn financial planning. The problem with this claim is it acts as an impediment for people to learn about financial planning and about investing. The reason is that if you believe that it's all common sense, then what's there to learn really, or put in the effort to learn? It's like if someone believed that science is just common sense and there's no need to put in the effort to learn science, there's really nothing to learn. Or, it seems kind of silly to be making this argument, but in a way, because finance and financial planning is a relatively new field, it's still relevant to make this argument. It's as though 100 years back, doctors had to make the argument that modern medicine is different from homeopathy. Today it's somewhat obvious, but a long time back, it may not have been as obvious to everyone. So for example, the last statement here that you can learn a majority of financial planning by reading any book on the topic. I have not come across any such book, and I'm pretty confident there is no such book, at least in India. Another such false claim is what you'll see on the slide, which is that Harry Markowitz doesn't use modern portfolio theory that he himself invented. This quote actually dates from prior to 1952, when he invented modern portfolio theory. So a lot of these quotes are completely out of context and are just being used to propagate this myth that finance, investing, financial planning is all very simple. So Harry Markowitz was one of the fathers of modern investing, and that's why it's kind of a very commonly used quote to try to make this argument, this false argument. In all the 40 odd articles and videos that I've done in the past, I've tried to keep them simple, avoid jargon, or if I'm forced to use jargon, then to explain that piece of jargon. But in this video, I'll probably have to do it slightly differently. I can't go into making everything very simple. There would be some jargon which I may not explain because it's not relevant. That's not really the point of this video, to get every bit of those points which are in using the jargon. And also, this video may not be very precise. It would just kind of brush over many different things, and there's no time to go into the nuances. So let's look at what are the results of this false view that financial planning is just common sense. So one, there's a popular book on financial planning in India which says that you can retire rich by investing ₹40 a day. 2 points from this. One, if financial planning was so simple, nobody would write such an incorrect statement. And it is so common, it is such common sense, no publisher would publish it. But this book is now in its second edition. So in a sense, proving the point that it's not just common sense. The next quote here is, point number 2, is a quote from an international book, again completely wrong, which says that you can retire with 25 times your annual expenses at the age of 30 or 40. So the international books are a little better than the Indian ones, but even there it's hard to find good ones. Again, proof that people seem to all get it wrong on this. The reason why many of these financial planning books or statements are wrong is because people are making lots of mistakes in the understanding of investing. So let's look at a few investing examples. The textbook classic example is the technical analysis indicates that you should buy or sell or something like that, either a stock or the market. And this is being debunked multiple times by academic finance professionals. So it's the textbook case of the homeopathy version of the world versus the modern medicine version of the world. Another quote from another popular finance practitioner / influencer is that what you see in point number 4 about S&P's rating of Indian government bonds. Clearly wrong, but again, all stemming from the view that there's really nothing much to learn in finance, economics, all of that. You can just make any statement, everything's fine. A few more examples. One is, there's a bunch of them. Some of them are easier, some of them are more difficult. So, for example, point number 8, which is equity safe in the long term, is a relatively tough point. Wouldn't really, no shame in getting that one wrong. It's a very tough one to understand. That it is a myth that equity is safe in the long term. So, but in general, there are many of these which just come from this view that finance is very simple, investing very simple. Some of these, for example, point number 6 on factor funds is often a way in which practitioners try to con non-practitioners by using some jargon by which non-practitioners would not understand. So the general caveat that a lot of the jargon is just meant to confuse investors or clients is true, but unfortunately there's a lot of jargon in finance. So William Sharpe, Nobel Prize winner, has exactly the opposite point of view, and his view is that retirement planning is the hardest problem in finance. So it's exactly the opposite view of what you find these practitioner influencers mentioning on Twitter, etc. So rather silly to ask which of these views is correct, but obviously William Sharpe is correct. The equation that you see there is a capital asset pricing model for which he won the Nobel Prize, and this equation was from 1964. So to just make the point, you see what the equation you see on the screen is the option pricing equation for a call option, published somewhere around 1973, and this was simple enough to solve. It looks complex, but I'm just trying to make the point that this is simple enough to solve. The reason why retirement planning has not been solved, there are many reasons for it, but one of them is it's a harder problem than option pricing. So William Sharpe is actually continues to work on that problem during his retirement and worked pretty hard on it. So he's even written a book on the topic. But it's just a point that it's that hard a problem to solve. In a bit we'll come to why it's so hard, but let me just start with a simple example. When I had to first make this point on my website that retirement planning is the hardest problem in finance, I wanted to find an easy way, so I used this anecdote or illustration of a person who starts saving for retirement at the age of 40, starts saving 40% of his post-tax salary, and by the age of 73, he retires at 60, and then by the age of 73, he runs out of money completely. I was hoping that this would be a simple example to make the point that calculating all of this is not trivially easy. Let's look at how William Sharpe has approached the problem, because that might also provide us some sense of why this is such a hard problem. So he lists 6 unknowns that make it a very hard problem, make retirement planning a very hard problem to solve. The fourth in particular is a little easier to solve in the US, where there are good products like tips. In India, since you don't have equivalent products, it's an even harder, it's a incredibly hard problem to solve in India, because you don't have various essential products to solve this problem. And so even though it's a little more solvable in the US, it's even worse in India to solve this problem. That doesn't mean one shouldn't try, but it's just a hard problem. Why is this not obvious that retirement planning, financial planning, whatever, is such a hard problem? So one is, you can have like 100 books written on financial planning probably in India, and more so across the world. And each of them will keep saying various wrong things, like say 40 rupees a day. One will say retire at 30 or 25 times your income. If 100 people attempt this, accidentally someone will get this one point right. But then they would have got a lot of other points completely wrong. So for example, point number 3 talks of a book which is not completely wrong on how much you need to save, accidentally, but then goes on to make a completely nonsensical statement that individual investors in India should directly purchase equity shares as the core equity portion of their portfolio. Complete nonsense. So accidentally they may get something right, but something else will be terribly wrong. So to reiterate, if enough people attack the problem and just say different random things, one of them will accidentally be right, at least on one point. Overall they'll still be wrong, but on one tiny point they may still accidentally be right. So another reason is why it's not obvious is, once somebody has been, take for example, this is a bunch of articles I've written in 2018, so this is more than these are 3 years old roughly, and I've been repeating them in many articles. So after someone's been kind of saying it, you've heard them say it, it sounds a little more obvious, and then you say, okay, I always thought this, maybe it's not that hard to understand. So for example, point number 3, why I wrote an article in 2018 about why active mutual funds in India are unable to beat the index. Empirically they're unable to. Mathematically there is a point that the average active investor net of fees cannot beat the index. Investor, I said, right? But taking that further to say why the average active mutual fund is unable to beat the index, so put that in simple English. So I wrote such an article in 2018, and I've been writing that since then in many articles, and now there's another RI also who's been, since last year, been writing a few articles to make this point. So once you've come across several articles making this point, it gets a little easier to think, yeah, this is kind of obvious. But 3 years back when I wrote it, it wasn't obvious to most people. And it was true then, it was true from probably 2005. So it's been true for a very long time. Just that you needed someone to come and say that, and take the message to more people. The Spiva report has been going on for a long time, and has been saying this for a very long time, long before I wrote about it. These are a bunch of articles similarly in 2019. For example, that equity is risky even in the long term. Factor funds do not beat the index on a risk adjusted basis. So this is now almost 2 years old. So once you get used to hearing these, they sound a little more obvious. Another reason is why it's not obvious is finance is often counterintuitive. So for example, the first time, that's with point number 1, the first time I fully understood this math, that the average investor, average active investor is guaranteed, mathematically guaranteed, to underperform the index net of costs. So this is from William Sharpe's paper, The Arithmetic of Active Management. So I was always a believer in index funds and I'd seen the empirical data, etc. But when I first read this uh, point, I figuratively fell off my chair. It was that counterintuitive. So that's one reason. So it's not just common sense. Similarly, with point number two, people have an easier time. Some people have an easier time understanding it with respect to Indian government dollar-denominated bonds, but they struggle to understand it with Indian government rupee-denominated bonds. Why this should be true? So it's not that these things are not that obvious. And with point number three, you hear everyone around you saying equity is safe in the long term. So then it kind of becomes part of the common wisdom, but it's wrong. So there are many things in finance that are counterintuitive, and till you make the effort to learn them and keep an open mind to learn them, you won't learn the right answers to them. Another reason is, even say when I'm talking to my clients, I might, for example, with about 2 hours of effort, figure out that I'm using an extreme example here to make the point, and only in the financial planning domain. So after about a couple of hours of effort, I might figure out that, okay, this client has to cut expenses from 30 lakhs a year to 20 lakhs a year. So it's kind of easy to just, like a doctor would scribble a prescription, say cut expenses from 30 lakhs a year to 20 lakhs a year, go home and do that. This is kind of how maybe a doctor in a government hospital would have to do it, just scribble a prescription. And that's important and necessary, because that's the way to deliver low cost healthcare to a large number of people. But essentially what you're doing in this case is telling that person to turn their life upside down. So especially for someone who can afford to pay to understand why that is so, and it's important for them to, because why would someone turn their life around till they knew why they should, or they were convinced that they should, otherwise they headed to disaster. So a bit like a doctor in a private hospital or a private clinic, a few RIs like myself then go into the details of explaining the maths of it, so the client understands why they need to cut their expenses from 30 lakhs to 20 lakhs and why 30 lakhs is unsustainable. So for example, this is based on the zero real return concept that I wrote about in 2018, that if this client is spending 30 lakhs a year for 30 years, they need to have 9 crores. Let's assume they're just retired, but they have only 6 crores. So with 6 crores for 30 years, they can only spend 20 lakhs. So they have to understand that math for them to then turn their life upside down. Otherwise, they really wouldn't be convinced to turn their life upside down. So just like a private sector doctor would explain the rationale for their medicines, the side effects, all of that. All of this is important to explain for someone to change what they do and feel confident that they should make this change. But even though I might go into great detail and maybe spend hours explaining this, there's still, just like an iceberg, that's probably just a tiny fraction, not even 1% of the reason for that statement. There's another 99+%, maybe more like 99.9% of it below, that I cannot explain to clients. I've never tried explaining to most clients, because it'll take too much of time, and it's a waste of money for the client for me to get into those details. It'll also be hard to explain some very technical points to a client. So there's a lot of finance, statistics, economics that's below the surface that the RI has to understand before making that statement, but cannot really explain all that to a client. It'll just take too much of time, and it's too technical. Often clients may not have the technical background to understand all that. So it's just like an MBBS doctor, for example. I mean, one small difference here is that an MBBS doctor could prescribe certain medicines, a general practitioner who's just only an MBBS. Luckily for doctors, they don't have to understand the mechanism of action of a drug. Most MBBS doctors don't understand the mechanism of action of how a drug works for most drugs that they prescribe, or most doctors wouldn't know. And that's fine, because medicine is advanced so much that it's great that doctors don't have to know all those details. They can trust that this drug says that it does X, these are the side effects, etc. These are the drug interactions. And a doctor can have confidence to go ahead and recommend it. there's still some trial and error, but the doctor doesn't have to understand the mechanism of action. Unfortunately, finance has not got to that point today. Most products are garbage, so an RIA has to understand what the mechanism of action of sorts of which of these 99 products are garbage and which one would make sense for a client. And modern investing is just 83 years old, starting in the earliest, I would trace it back is to 1938. So it's young compared to modern medicine, and that's why, and probably it's not going to evolve or advance as fast in terms of becoming a science like modern medicine. I'm not claiming that either of them is an exact science, neither of them is an exact science, but they're both a science of some kind. So the crux of it is that no RIA, including myself, would really explain the full rationale to clients. The final reason is that most people, if you don't know something, you don't know that you don't know it, or you don't know there's more to know. So, and that's compounded by the fact that financial planning, finance investing has a very deep body of knowledge. So often people won't know what they don't know. This is a photo of a few of the books that I used on my website, just to illustrate. When I just had to put some image on my website. So these are a few books that influenced me. These are not book recommendations. These are not books. These are definitely not books I would recommend. But these are few books that influenced me during my evolution as an investor. And so they cut across finance, statistics, economics, international economics, strategy, various things. And this is just probably like maybe a tiny fraction of the books I would have read and papers, academic papers I would have read on all of this. The point I'm trying to make is that it's a very deep body of knowledge. So this would not even be like 5% of things that I would have read on this topic. So just to illustrate some examples of finance, economics, and statistics. So for example, I have probably never explained to any client this point that active investors are on the average mathematically guaranteed to underperform the index net of cost, because it's an incredibly difficult point to explain. So I mean, a lot of people, even after reading Sharpe's paper 20 times, will not understand it, or even 100 times may not understand it. It's like a light bulb has to go off in your head, but you need a lot of background before that light bulb goes off in your head. The second example is in economics about S&P's credit rating for Indian government bonds. So to understand that, you need to understand lots of economics, and to take the most ridiculous example, because it's easy to use a ridiculous example, or a very simple point, is there's what's called MMT, or the so-called modern monetary theory, essentially garbage. But to be able to understand points like this, you have to understand why MMT is garbage. I mean, there's much more complicated things you need to understand. What's a better theory to explain inflation, etc., because that's what essentially high government debt and inflation, etc., is what S&P is thinking of when it's giving this rating. So you need to understand what alternative theory could make more sense to understand government debt, inflation, which is a very non-linear concept. Finally, on statistics, a lot of finance, economics rests on statistics, and a lot of the silly statements you hear are because of incorrect understanding of statistics. So this point that equity is risky even in the long term is a very deep statistical point. I remember when I was reading various articles and academic papers on it, it took me a while to also fully understand it. And I can pretty much guarantee that you are never going to fully understand all of investing, finance, and all of this. The reason is I've spent 35 years studying all of this, and still occasionally once in a year I come across a new point a important new point that I hadn't come across earlier and hadn't understood earlier. So 35 years after I've been doing this actively, consistently, with a lot of effort, if I still find things that I didn't know earlier, it's unlikely that you in your lifetime are going to figure out all of it. But that doesn't mean you don't try. You should try hard. So what do you do about it? About all these things that I've said? They don't communicate anything specific. There's no specific concept I'm communicating. Primarily what I'm communicating is that financial planning, retirement planning is hard. Put in the effort to understand it. And the way you got to go about doing that is definitely self-learning. And you may have to occasionally use somebody's help to learn a little more. Both aspects are important. For example, and with self-learning, for example, you should be reading international books on this topic, because the international books are better than the Indian books. But that self-learning is important because even if you want to engage with somebody, you need adequate knowledge to know who to engage with. For example, you need adequate knowledge to understand why, for example, there are only 25 financial planning professionals in India. And I'm using the keyword is professionals. There are a large number, hundreds, thousands, lakhs of financial planning businessmen, but there are only 25 financial planning professionals in India. Unless you have adequate learning, you would engage with the wrong person and not realize you need to engage with one of these 25. So it's a combination of these two. I've written probably half a dozen articles about how to find the right advisor to engage with, etc. Probably haven't said much about self-learning, so let me just mention one input on that. So just like with investment advice, if you're engaging with a RIA, transparency in fees minimizes conflict of interest. So that's the crux of why people like myself, Patu, etc. keep talking of fixed fees. In my case, more precisely hourly fees, which is the same, a variant of the same thing, is because transparency in fees minimizes conflict of interest. The same thing is applicable to self-learning also. Look for transparency in fees. There is no such thing as really free advice even in self-learning. There are some forms of compensation that is going to anybody who's even giving you apparently free advice, so through your attention for advertisements or anything of that kind, or a book where you pay for the book, etc. So the trick here is there's always something that the person is getting in return for giving you advice, even if it's an article or a book or whatever, or a video, or YouTube video. The key bit to understand is if they are promoting a product in that video or article, etc., is this a form of disclose? Is it disclosed, or is it obvious to you that this is advertising, or is it not obvious and it is hidden and it's undisclosed that this is advertising or affiliate marketing? So watch out for this when you're learning things by yourself, and it's a very useful clue to figure out even more. To the extent that someone is promoting a product without disclosing that this is actually advertising or affiliate marketing, be very suspicious about it. The fact that they're not disclosing it means that they want it to be more impactful by hiding the fact that it's actually advertising or marketing. And while it's not a red flag about the influencer, because they're just trying to earn their living, it's a very useful red flag about the product. The fact that this product had to stoop so low to use undisclosed advertising or affiliate marketing to promote itself means there's something shady about it, and you need to beware of that product. So even though you may not have adequate knowledge to understand what's the flaw in the product, the fact that it's stooping this low should tell you that it's probably a devious, unethical product, which is more likely going to harm you, and you should be on your guard. So if possible, avoid influencer videos. Almost all of them are garbage. But if you accidentally happen to watch one because your friend sent it to you, etc., then you could take some benefit out of it by noticing this undisclosed advertising or affiliate marketing, remembering the product that was marketed as one such toxic product that you need to be aware of. So all those influencers out there are probably going to destroy millions of lives that like they have been doing with by recommending crypto exchanges and cryptocurrencies and various other such financial products, not just such stupid ones like crypto, but less stupid ones. So there are millions of Indians who are going to have their lives destroyed through these influencers, and that's difficult for many of us to solve. But you could potentially be one of the few people who inadvertently benefit from these influencers if you can take away a signal that these are toxic products that the influencer is not disclosing that they have a commercial arrangement with. You could be one of those very few people who, rather than having their lives harmed by these influencers, actually for opposite reasons benefited by these influencers.